Hi everyone. On behalf of Sam Cumming, Rory Kelly, and myself, I'd like to thank you for attending our presentation on temporal continuity. In this presentation, we discuss the temporal interpretation of narrative film. How does the runtime of a film correspond to the timeline of the story it depicts? Some stretches of storytelling have temporally continuous interpretations, by which we mean that an unbroken interval of presentation time represents a similarly unbroken stretch of story time. In a stage play, for instance, each scene represents action continuously, with the temporal discontinuities introduced only at scene breaks. In film, individual shots are likewise intervals of continuous temporal representation. This is true even if the footage is slowed down, sped up, played in reverse, and so on. Such footage still represents story time continuously. But what happens to time between shots? This question is our focus today. What is the temporal interpretation of a cut in a narrative film? For instance, when a cut marks a scene break, we are used to reading it as an ellipsis in time. And in the case of flashbacks, time may even leap backwards at a scene break. But for cuts within a scene, temporally continuous interpretation seems to be the norm. When a cut is interpreted as temporally continuous, we call it a time bridge. As we will see, there are also cuts within a scene which are interpreted as temporal discontinuities, where the film jumps over points on the timeline. This we call a time jump. Examples of both time bridges and time jumps occur in this scene from Better Call Saul. The scene takes place in a courtroom and begins with a seated Saul Goodman who is undergoing a crisis of conscience. He is unwittingly defending a brutal murderer, and the victim's mother sits crying behind him. The first several cuts of the clip are temporally continuous time bridges, but eventually the sounds of the courtroom become muted, suggesting that Saul's mind is far away, until the voice of the judge breaks through, addressing him. This heralds a final cut from a close-up to a medium-wide shot in which Saul is now standing as he reacts to the judge's words. This last cut is clearly interpreted as a temporally discontinuous time jump. Here's the clip.
Mr. Goodman.
That's right, Your Honor. Witness tampering.
Just before the last cut, Saul was sitting. After the cut, he is standing. Time has clearly elapsed, long enough for Saul to get to his feet. The central theme of our talk is the idea that cuts within a scene are interpreted as time bridges by default. Cuts within a scene are interpreted as time jumps only when explicitly cued. With this in mind, let's look again at the clip from Better Call Saul, this time without the audio track. Here we have a sequence of time bridge cuts. But the final cut, coming up, is a time jump. Most of the edits in this clip, like the cut illustrated here, involve changes in perspective or subject matter which are physically congruent. Without a specific reason or cue to make us think otherwise, we interpret this cut as a time bridge. In the last cut, however, there is an obvious physical displacement of the main character from sitting to standing that is incompatible with continuous time, and explicitly cues a time jump. In this case, the time jump develops a complex psychological metaphor. As we read it, Saul has become disconnected from what is going on around him, including the progress of
Mr.
others.
Goodman.
The judge's voice penetrates to the past where Saul's mind still lags and hauls him back to the present where he finally acts. 2. Bridging time. To develop these ideas about temporal interpretation, we'll focus first on the phenomenon of time bridging, and our claim that cuts within a scene are interpreted as time bridges by default. This cut from the middle of the Better Call Saul clip is a good example of why we think the time bridge interpretation holds by default. Nothing in the audio-visual content forces us to read the transition as temporally continuous. The continuous diegetic audio bridging the cut is asynchronous, so it provides no guide to the temporal interpretation of the cut. At the same time, there is no physical displacement that would force a temporally discontinuous interpretation either. Saul could have held this fixed position for almost any length of time. That we accept the cut as a time bridge rather than a time jump, despite the absence of concrete evidence either way, reveals the presence of a default assumption of temporal continuity. We note that the default time bridge interpretation of a cut applies even when spatial continuity is not precisely achieved. Except in cases of multi-camera shoots, the same action taken from different camera angles will never exactly match. For this reason, match-on-action cuts are usually only approximate, but temporal continuity is still the norm. Editors may, in fact, introduce a gap or an overlap in the action between two shots to speed up the action or smooth it out. Here is a match-on-action from Billy Wilder's The Apartment. It occurs on Jack Lemmon's action of sitting down in a chair. It plays smoothly enough, but we must reveal that we removed 12 frames from the A side of the cut. Here's how the cut actually appears in the film. Both cuts work, and both seem to be time bridges. Our version simply speeds up the action a bit. On close inspection, our version creates a noticeable gap in the action, but the presence of a gap, or in some cases an overlap, does not mean that the same is transmitted to the mind of the audience. Such fine-tuning by an editor does not create small jumps forward or backward in time. So, even though true visual continuity is not always attained or even aimed for, temporal continuity is still typically registered by the viewer. Here, by the way, is how the original cut breaks down. It seems there may be small overlap in action on the B side of the cut. If so, the editor probably did this because they believed it smoothed the action out. Our version is more contemporary in the sense that editors today are more likely to speed up action, which is part of what David Bordwell calls intensified continuity. As final evidence for the time bridging default, we note that the exceptions, time jumps, are often explicitly marked in the screenplay. For instance, cut to within a scene can be used to indicate a time jump, as in the script pictured here. Sometimes the writer will even insert the words later, like in the script here. Time bridge reinforcement. Although time bridge is the default interpretation, a number of techniques have emerged to reinforce this interpretation. For instance, a temporally continuous interpretation of a visual cut will often be reinforced by laying diegetic sound across the cut. At the opening of Wim Wenders' Until the End of the World, a Talking Heads song plays in the background for several minutes as a woman wanders past the remains of a house party. The scene spreads across several shots with the song continuing over each cut. Thus, the cuts may all be interpreted as consistent with the audio as instantaneous changes of viewpoint. The diegetic interpretation is reinforced by various means, including the synchronous video clip playing on a large screen in one room. This interpretation is also reinforced by the changes in audio perspective as the character moves closer to and then farther from the music source. Re-recording mixers are always attentive to audio perspective changes like this because they reinforce continuity. Establishing a pattern of cross-cutting between two parallel lines of action at two locations is another way to reinforce a sequence of time bridge interpretations. There seems to be a convention according to which a temporally continuous unit is constructed by alternating between the two locations. Cutting between locations as part of cross-cutting is therefore crucially different than repeatedly breaking the scene. Cross-cutting reinforces time bridging, but breaking the scene allows for time jumping. This distinction is again recognized by scriptwriters. Note that there is a standard format in a screenplay for a slug line that introduces a new scene, like int phone booth day, for example. When instead the screenwriter wants to indicate a continuous temporal progression between different locations, they will tend to veer away from this format. For instance, in a sequence that involves temporally continuous cross-cutting between different lines of action at different locations, the intercut header can be used once the locations are established by initial slug lines, in this case a phone booth and an office. Finally, match on action conveys a sense of motion continuing across the cut and hence implies a time bridge. This is the effect observed before in our clip from the apartment. We speculate that the match-on-action technique exploits the capacity of film, even at cuts, to create the illusion of motion. Clearly, if we perceive continuous motion, then we perceive time as continuous through that motion, and hence over the cut. Editing around time bridges. The default for time bridge is so pervasive and so powerful that it tends to impose temporal continuity even at the expense of narrative coherence. As a result, editors must carefully curate the footage between time bridge shots of key events to ensure a sensible narrative. For example, a clean entrance is a shot where the actor begins entirely out of the frame, and a clean exit is one where they end up entirely out of the frame. Clean entrances or exits allow for an imagined journey through space while the characters are off-screen, even if time is assumed to be continuous. To illustrate, in this clip from a movie made by one of us, the actor does not make a clean exit in the first shot, but does make a clean entrance in the second shot. The reason it was cut this way is because the actor is crossing a small room. If he were allowed to cleanly exit the first shot and cleanly enter the second shot, then, assuming a time bridge, it would seem to take him too long to travel such a short distance. As this suggests, when characters are covering longer distances, clean entrances and exits can be used in the edit to provide the time that is needed for them to traverse those distances, and so can be used to maintain temporal continuity. If we return to our example from Until the End of the World, the actress cleanly exits this shot, which then focuses on the sculpture for a moment, before she cleanly enters this shot in a completely different room. In this case, by allowing the actress to cleanly exit and cleanly enter each frame, time is provided for her to travel from one room to another. Probably not enough time, but the strategy masks or covers that allotted time, so that the default time bridge interpretation makes sense in the context of the story. If the sequence were recut this way, her journey from one room to the other would appear to be cut out. The cut feels rushed. This may be because the time bridge interpretation is engaged, even though this interpretation doesn't fit the context of the narrative. Both cutaways and insert shots can likewise be used to shorten the presentation of a scene without introducing physical anomalies, and hence without violating the audience's impression that time is proceeding continuously. The principle is the same as for clean exits and entrances. Cutaways and inserts provide time for an action to progress off-screen, while time progresses continuously. In this intentionally absurd example from American Pickle, this pattern of interpretation is put to darkly humorous effect.
We have wedding in front of whole town. Hashem blesses us.
Kozaki!
For a bit. We are attacked by Cossacks. Bloodthirsty, Jew-hungry Russian maniacs, drunk from vodka. The Cossacks destroy our whole world.
While it is clearly the case that all the destruction could not have taken place during the time we were on the characters' faces, the clip nonetheless demonstrates that, by invoking a sequence of time bridges, editors have a great deal of control over story time. The only reason we get the joke in this clip is because we understand that the clip represents time, impossibly, as continuous. 3. Jumping time. We turn next to the complex phenomena of time jumps, and our claim that cuts within a scene are interpreted as time jumps only when explicitly cued. Time jumps are deliberately edited, often to hustle the story along, and are by now a mainstay of cinematic storytelling. Here we outline a few of the techniques that filmmakers use and audiences recognize to cue a time jump. First, fades and dissolves are conventionally used to indicate temporal leaps. Wipes are often used to the same effect, but sometimes suggest approximate simultaneity, which involves the possibility of a short time jump backwards. It is as if the filmmaker is saying, at around the same time in another location, such and such is happening. This is the case in this example from Star Wars. While Obi-Wan, Luke, and Chewbacca are in the bar, the droids are waiting outside because, well, no droids are allowed. The wipe overcomes the default time bridge interpretation of the cut. But even if the edit is a cut, a time jump will still be indicated if there is what we'll call a physical anomaly. Of course, any cut from one shot to another presents a discontinuity in the visual stream. This visual discontinuity necessitates a temporal one only when a significant physical displacement of an object or character is observable at the cut. If some physical objects have altered their positions, if a subject goes from sitting to standing, for example, then time must have elapsed, or else the story clock has been wound back. Either way, we infer a time jump. In fact, we have not found a single example of a time jump within a scene without such a physical anomaly. It seems to be required to overcome the default time bridge interpretation at an intra-scene cut. Indeed, the pressure towards the default time bridge interpretation is so strong that, to ensure a time jump, the physical anomaly must be correspondingly significant. To illustrate, in the 1992 film The Water Dance, there is a scene in which a character is interviewed by a psychiatrist after breaking his neck in an accident. In the original edit of the film, which we've recreated here, cuts in the interview were supposed to indicate time jumps. But as you can see, the absence of significant physical anomaly leads to an awkward cut that is not so easy to read as a time jump.
It's a nice sweater you've got on there. Do all shrinks wear sweaters? I remember Judd Hirsch had a nice sweater on in Ordinary People. I really rely mainly on my girlfriend in this. She is nice. She's great. She's a great girl. Smart, funny.
As a result, the director and the editor chose, in the final version of the film, to replace the cuts with short fades, which conventionally cue a time jump.
What are you writing there? Well, you know, I'm hopeful. I am. I'm hopeful. Oh, no. I'm anticipating the psychological crash. I have it penciled into my calendar already. I think it happens, next week sometime.
We noted earlier that continuous diegetic sound could reinforce a time bridge. Could we then indicate a time jump by introducing an obvious audio elision, for example, skipping forward in a song? Interestingly, it seems that such an unvarnished ellipsis in diegetic sound is rare in mainstream works. A new scene could be heralded by an abrupt exchange of diegetic sound environments, but this kind of rough-edged punctuation is, we have found, generally avoided for time jumps mid-scene. So time jumps differ from time bridges in that their temporal meaning generally is not reinforced by the diegetic audio. Perhaps this is because time bridges only hold by default, whereas time jumps are manifest in physical anomalies. Since the temporal rupture is already abundantly clear on the visual track, then the audio track is free to serve other goals. For instance, as we've seen, audio marks the end of Saul's period of interior reflection.
Mr. Goodman.
The audio prelap of the judge's voice also creates a bridge between the two shots. As this demonstrates, audio can be recruited to maintain a connection between shots linked by time jumps. In fact, many of the various audio features accompanying time jumps could be explained as connecting the shots, reinforcing our sense that they belong to the same dramatic unit. If we return to a previous example from 2001, it uses continuous score to bridge a half dozen time jumps as well as a flash forward. Voiceover would have had a similar effect. An unchanging diegetic atmosphere would reassure us that we were in the same place at more or less the same time. These factors are put into creative tension in a clip from Season 2 of The Crown. The scene occurs in the episode where Princess Margaret visits the art photographer. As she is walking up the stairs to a studio, there is a cut. The cut is a time jump, since on the other side, she is already seated in the studio. However, on the audio track, the footsteps continue with a changed perspective. They've become quieter. Thus, we have the kind of audio transition we would expect across a temporally continuous cut. However, it's really a trick. The footsteps in the second shot are those of the art photographer who is now descending the stairs to meet her.
Upstairs!
Finally, scene breaks, usually accompanied by a change of setting, are the most familiar way to introduce a time jump. Though we note that the definition of a scene break remains elusive. Since the concept of a scene plays an essential role in our account of time bridges and time jumps, it would be nice to have a definition of a scene break that is independent of its temporal consequences. But unfortunately, the standard working definition of a scene break is something like a change of location except where the action is continuous. It's not that scene breaks are mysterious, but for a theory of temporal interpretation, this is a topic that requires further discussion. 4. Temporal continuity. Temporally continuous interpretation, as we've documented it here, bears a complex relationship to what film scholars normally call continuity or continuity editing. Continuity editing, as we all know, is a style that aims to keep the focus on the story and keep the nuts and bolts of the storytelling, cuts in particular, under the hood. While registering a temporal discontinuity requires noticing a cut, continuity style does not avoid time jumps. Even in the continuity style, we notice the cuts at scene breaks. The ideal of continuity is not to hide every cut from the audience, but instead only those they don't need to register. Since it is sometimes a filmmaker's goal to convey a change of time or place to the audience, they are required in those cases to make the audience aware of the edit marking the transition between the different times or places. This is presumably why the more noticeable edits, such as fades and dissolves, are employed for this purpose. Note too that even on Tim Smith's attentional theory of continuity editing, there are two avenues for achieving continuity at a cut. One is making the cut invisible. If you hide the cut, you obviously convey a sense of continuous time. The other is rendering it innocuous by motivating the transition even after the fact. If the narrative motivations of a time jump are legible to the audience, as in our example from Better Call Saul, then they are consistent with the continuity style, which only requires that visible cuts be motivated even after the fact. Time jumps, then, are consistent with the continuity style as long as they don't seem like accidents or open-ended experiments. It follows that temporal continuity, the interpretation of continuous time in the story, must be distinguished from continuity proper. On the other hand, as this presentation has brought out, the two ideas are also closely connected. Continuity on set creates the physical match between shots that allows a cut to receive its default temporally continuous interpretation. Many of the rules and techniques of filming and editing in the continuity style, including the 30-degree rule, the use of cutaways, inserts, clean exits and entrances, and cross-cutting, can be viewed as methods for ensuring temporal continuity, by avoiding the presentation of a physical anomaly to the eye that would disrupt the smoothly continuous reading of time in the brain. The impression of temporal continuity is, then, an effect to be taken seriously when trying to understand the continuity system, one that should be considered alongside the familiar goal of hiding the cut and the standard conventions of continuity filmmaking. Thank you for your time.